Welcome to Casual Friday. So first, a couple of people asked to see the blanket that I was making for Max, the dog trainer that I talked about a few weeks ago. They wanted to see it when it was completed, so I just finished it, just wove in all the ends. So I will stand up and show you. The top third and the bottom third are the same. They have sections of knit 3, purl 3 garter, and then the center is knit 15, purl 15 garter. And then the center section is on the sides, it's knit 9, purl 9 garter. In the center, it's knit 5, purl 5 garter. And then each of the 3 sections is joined to its neighbor with a 3 needle I-cord bind off, and then I picked up stitches around the entire edge and then worked an I-cord bind off for the edges. So I chose to do so in the center where it's a knit 15, purl 15, and then in the center of the section where it's knit 15, purl 15, and then in the middle, the second section of the second horizontal section, right below that, it's knit 5, purl 5. And I did that so that they would line up, so that these vertical, divisions between the larger sections would line up with the smaller ones. All I really have left to do in that blanket is just to wash it and dry it. And then I can give it to the baby's parents. The baby hasn't been born yet. He was due on Sunday, but hasn't been born yet. So back in February, I did finish it February. Look, I pulled out all my works in progress and made decisions about whether or not I was going to continue with them ever. And then I worked through as many of them as I could in February to complete as many as I could. And there were a couple of things I knew I wouldn't finish in February. One was that blanket. And then the other was this sweater. This is a lighter weight sweater than, was I finishing one sweater or two in February? For sure one, that big gray cabled sweater. And that one I wanted to be able to get some wear out of in the end of the winter season. And this other sweater is made with fingering weight, so it's a much lighter weight sweater. So I wasn't as concerned about finishing that one. So I've picked it up again. And it's a really interesting construction. It's worked top down. It is not a raglan though. It's not. I never do top down raglans, but it's a top down set in sleeve thing. But it's striped. So you starts out on this side with short or narrow stripes, and then the stripes get bigger across the back and then curve down, and then they end, I don't have a button band on this yet, and they end on the front with these wide stripes. So I've almost completed the first sleeve. I ran out of, where is it? The first sleeve with narrow stripes. The other sleeve will have the wide stripes, and I just ran out of the skein of the main color, so I have to wind up the final skein in order to complete the sleeve. But the reason I'm showing you this is because, first of all, I think that the short row striping thing is really cool. The name of this pattern is Stripes Gone Crazy by, I think her name is Alpha. I'll put it down on the screen so you can see it, and then I'll put a link down in the description to the sweater pattern. I bought the pattern when it first came out several years ago. And then I had to try to figure out, well, what 2 colors was I going to knit it with? What was the striped color and what was the main color? And then I started looking at project photos, and some people were using all kinds of colors from the striping. Many people apparently use the same yarns over and over again in different colors, and so they have lots of leftovers, and they are very good at combining colors, which I am not. This color combination is not one that I came up with myself. I realized that what I wanted to do was to get one of those mini skein gradient sets, and then some sort of background color. I had no idea what colors I wanted to use, but that was my plan. because as I've mentioned before, I'm slightly colorblind, and I don't have a lot of practice choosing colors, like more than 3. If I have to pick more than 3, then I have no idea what to do. Unless it was like rainbow colors with black background, I could do that. But other sorts of color combinations, very intimidated by, and I always need help. So I had come up with this idea, I'll get a gradient set and then some background color. So last spring, when I did the shop hop, that was on my list of things that I wanted to do. I had a list of things I wanted to buy so that I'd have a plan when I went from shop to shop. And one of the things was gradient set and main color. And I didn't know if I'd get them at the same shop or not. So there's a shop in St. Paul called the Yarnery. And the shop hop has a theme every year. Last year it was something to do with music. And so the Yarnery had chosen, I think, Bob Dylan songs. And they had, every shop has some custom yarn dyed for them, and they come up with a pattern for the shop hop. The yarns are dyed specifically for shop hop. If they run out during shop hop, that's it. They don't get more made, and that's it. So when I went to the Yarnery, they had 2 gradient sets made up from these Bob Dylan songs. One was Blown in the Wind, and that's the color set that I got, that my stripes are made from. And I thought, well, I like these colors, and then I was completely at a loss as to what other color I could put with them. And so the shop owner helped me, and I said, "Are you sure?" Let me show you. I said, "Are you sure?" Because I was really worried about which one? This color, because when they in the skein they looked like they were going to be too close together, and they're not. They're not too close. But when I was just looking at them, I thought, "Oh, is it actually gonna work?" And he's like, "Yes, it'll work." So the main color yarn, it's a different base than whatever the gradient set is made from, but they are exactly the same in terms of thickness, because a lot of fingering weight yarns vary. And it was also a special dye. It's some indie dyer. I can't remember. Again, I'll put it on the screen. And a lot of shops are doing this now, where they'll get an independent dyer to dye special colors just for their shop. And that's what the Yarnery had done. So these were special yarn, indie dyed yarns for the shop that wasn't to do with shop hop. So it was a separate thing. I had written down what the yardage was I needed, and so I thought I needed 1 gradient pack and 2 of these skeins, of the main color skeins. And I went back and I started knitting, and then I was looking at the size I was making, and I got in a panic because I realized I had not bought the correct amount of yarn. And I realized I was going to need another color of the main color, and I was also going to need another gradient pack, and I didn't think they would have the gradient pack. They had 1 hank of that main color yarn. That was it, and there wouldn't have been any other in that color anywhere else in the country. They had 1 skein left, so I ran down and got it. They had none of the gradient. So I didn't know what I was going to do. I'd already started the sweater. And so I went on to one of the Twin Cities Ravelry groups. There's Twin Cities Ravelers, and there's Minnesota Knitters, and then there's the Guild, and there's probably another one too. So I went on there and I said, "Oh, did anybody buy this that doesn't want it or is willing to part with it, and I'll buy it from you?" And so a woman said, "Oh, sure, I'll sell it to you." And I was trying to figure out how much it costs, and I couldn't tell because I only had the receipt for the total amount. I didn't even know how much it cost. And I said, "How much is it?" So I don't know, it was like $20 or $25, something like that. So we met at Mall of America. I kind of felt like it was like we were doing something illicit. She was standing outside the shop, with the gradient yarn pack looking around, and I came up to her and I handed her the money. She handed me the yarn, and I'm like, "Well, thanks." And so I got the yarn. I was so happy. So I worked on it like I always do, 3 weeks, and then I'd gotten the fronts and the back, which are all knit in one piece. And the sleeves down to the armhole, though that's all knit as one thing. And it had been 3 weeks, and time limit, and then I have to put it away for a while. So I'm just pulling it out now, and I think I'll finish it sometime in the next week, I'm hoping. And if spring continues the way it is today, I'll be wearing it. You'll notice I'm wearing a sweater today. Monday was like 92 degrees. It was so hot, and today it's back to being cold. So I might actually be able to wear this sweater sometime, or this spring maybe. Who knows? So now that it is technically spring, it is wool festival season, and it's also county and state fair season, I believe, for everyone. I don't think anybody would have had a state fair already this year. I know that in the southern states, they tend to do their state fairs when it's not in the middle of summer and super hot. The Minnesota State Fair is probably our largest like cultural event in the state. It's part of our state identity. We have arguably the largest state fair, although technically I think it's considered number 2. Our fair lasts for 12 days, the 12 days leading up to and including Labor Day, so end of August, beginning of September. And last year they had just under 2 million attendees over the course of that 12 days, and which is 35% of our state population. So it's huge. Texas has their state fair. The total number of attendees that they get is 2.4 million, but it's over 21 days. So we have the largest fair in terms of daily attendance, but they have the largest in terms of overall attendance. But that total attendance is less than 9% of their state population. So it's not as big a deal in their sort of state culture as the state fair is in Minnesota's. And so one of the nice things about having a great state fair and living in a northern climate, that means that the knitting competition in the Minnesota State Fair is enormous. It's huge. Knitting is like a competitive sport. It is a competitive sport here in Minnesota. And I just got an email on Monday announcing that online registration for the creative activities competition is now open. So you can register at any time up until, I think, August 7th, and then the fair is a couple of weeks after that. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit, like if you've never been to or seen a county fair or state fair, or if you're not from the United States and you don't know what these things are, I thought I'd just talk about a little bit and talk about what the knitting competition is like as a participant and as an observer of what I've seen and what I've kind of picked up about our fair anyway. And I've looked at other, because everybody's got their creative, they may not call it creative activities, they may call it something else, but they've all got their 2018 pamphlets with all the rules and all the different classifications of what each specific competition is. Those are all available now online. So regardless of what state you live in, you can find out when your fair is, when you can register to compete, and what the different groupings are for competitions. So in the 19th century, these state fairs and county fairs began, and is a way for, we were largely our agricultural economy, and it was a way for farmers to get together and they might have competitions for their different types of animals, and like who has the best bull or the best goats or whatever. They could learn about the newest technologies in farming, like this is when farm machinery was first really coming out. So you could see all of the new farm machines and the new types of crops and seeds and all that kind of stuff. And then about 100 years ago, here in Minnesota anyway, I don't know what it's like in other places, but about 100 years ago, they realized that, farming isn't just, the crop farmer or the dairy farm or whatever. Farms are also, the men and women had very defined roles on the farm, but they relied on each other. You couldn't run a farm without the husband and the wife. And you'll see this if one of them died, if the wife died, that farmer was remarried within about 6 months. And if the farmer died and the kids weren't big enough, that farm wife had to find herself a widowed farmer or a bachelor farmer, and they had to get married again. It was just too difficult. I think the one exception I've seen on my family tree is my second great grandfather, who was a German immigrant, and his wife died, I suspect, after her 9th child was born, and he never remarried, but he had 4 boys who were big enough to keep the farm going, and the youngest of whom was my great-grandfather, who was 10 years old, and he became mother to his 2 little sisters. So he's the only one I've seen who didn't remarry. Everybody else remarried right away. So anyway, 100 years ago, they called it, in Minnesota, they called it the Women's Building, and they had the competitions for like sewing and quilt making and for preserving and for baking, and they had all that. And then over time, as men also joined in some of these competitions, they switched it to being creative activities, and they've expanded what activities are included. Some things come and some things go. But because this is such a huge part of our Minnesota culture, it's a huge deal. So many people enter things in the fair. I mean, part of the fair is like, have you been to the fair yet? When are you going to the fair? How many times are you going to the fair? Are you entering anything in the fair this year? If somebody knows that you're a creative type, they will ask you, are you entering anything in the fair this year? And, it's a huge deal. So creative activities, they have 7 divisions here. They have, they call it needlecraft. They call it needlecraft. And then they have handcrafts, garment making. Then they have a division just for senior citizens, people who are over 65. And my take on that is that these are things that senior citizens have taken up in their later years. It's not like they're going to enter the knitting competition when they've been a great knitter all their lives. Like if you had a choice between entering the regular knitting competition and senior citizens, and you've been a knitter all your life, you'd probably enter the main one. But I don't know. And then there's baking, and then there's canning, and they're all huge. So there's like 840 different competitions within all these 7 divisions. And I think they had like 8,000 entries. So on average, every class, every competition has at least 9 people. But they get to the point where, and what they tend to do is some things are very specific. Like it gets so specific. Like for cookies, there's chocolate chip cookies with no oatmeal, fruit, or nuts. There's chocolate chip cookies with nuts, and chocolate chip cookie with oatmeal. Apparently, raisins aren't allowed in any oatmeal cookie. But they have 3 competitions for just chocolate chip cookies. So the first year I entered a vest that I had knit for the Master Hand Knitting program, and it was for my level 2 vest, and I had really done a great job on the finishing, I felt, and I wanted to enter it just to see what would happen. And there's Herbie. It was the only thing I entered, and I was super nervous about it. And I mean, I felt like I had learned a lot in the Master Hand Knitting program, but I still didn't really have a sense of what my knitting was like compared to anybody else's, and I had heard that the competition in the state fair was pretty strong. And so I entered it, and I entered a vest. So it's in the United States, a vest is a sleeveless sweater, basically. And they had three classes of competition for the vest. They had there's one that's plain, which means stocking stitch, reverse stocking stitch, or garter stitch. And then they had one that was textured knits, that could be lace or cables or knit purl patterns, whatever. And then they had color work, which could be like stranded color work or intarsia or something. So they had three competitions for that. So I entered mine in the textured knit. And I didn't place it on. I was super disappointed. I thought, I can't believe I didn't even place. And so I went around and I looked at the 5 entries that did place in my category. And every one of them had texture on the front and the back, and my vest only had it on the front. And the comment that I got had a really good score, but the comment was, nice work, competitive class, or something like that. So that was when I started to realize, okay, here's, when you have a more general category like just textured knit, there's a spectrum of what texture could be, and having it only on the front wasn't quite good enough. So everything else had something on the back. So then I started looking at, well, what do they have for sweaters? And the sweaters, there were, I think, 16 different sweater categories. First of all, they divide them by cardigan and pullover. So those are completely separate. And in the texture category for sweaters, they had limited texture was one option. And then another competition was all over texture. So my textured vest was in a category that in sweaters would have been separated out. And so then I'm like, okay, so you're more likely to win if not only your knitting has to be good, first of all, but you're more likely to win if you have the more complex the knitting is for your garment. So that was the first lesson I learned from that. And then I waited a couple of years. Maybe the next year or a couple of years later, I submitted a hat, and it was a baby hat I had designed. And then I was like, well, I don't understand. I don't see it anywhere. It was a baby hat. And there was nothing in the hand knitted subdivision about baby garments. It was starting with child, size 3 and up. And then most things were adults. And so then I started realizing, there is knitting competition outside of the hand knitting group, because they group all of these things. They try to group them together in things that are like each other. And so the baby hat was in a group of classes that were within garment making. So they had garment making, and then they had infant and toddler garments. And then within the infant and toddler garments, they had things like a bib. Then they had a hat or a bonnet, I think could be sewn. And then they had one crocheted maybe versus knit. And then they had like a whole little outfit or whatever, it could be knitted, and then there's one for crochet. So some of the knitting is in garment making, which is a separate division from the needlecraft. Then there's a division called handcrafts, and that's like metalwork and woodwork and beading and weaving and doll making and polymer clay, all these things that aren't to do with needles. And within that, they have things like knitted toys or clothing for dolls, things like that. So you really have to look outside of just the categories for hand knitting sometimes to find what it is that you want to compete with. There's also like table linens, and so they'll have like what do they call it, like a lunch cloth or a dinner cloth or table runners, things like that. And then within those, you might have one that's all lace that could be crocheted or knitted or tatted. And then they'll have hardanger, and then they'll have embroidery. So things that like embroidery would be, different kinds of embroidery might be competing against each other within lunch cloths. So they have all these different categories. So I think I counted them up, and we have, I think, 60. Close to 59 or 60 competitions. Is that right? 50 or 60? Just in hand knitting, and then you have another 5 in the table linens, and another 4 or 5 in the baby garments, and then there's some more in like handcrafts for the doll-based things. So just depending on what it is that you want to compete in, then you'll be in different divisions. Now I've looked at other state fairs, like California is a huge state. The California State Fair in Sacramento, maybe 640,000 people go to it. But the LA County Fair, which normally you think of a county fair as being smaller than a state fair, LA County Fair is at least twice that big. So, and they do have knitting, but there might be three classes. So they might have one that's blankets and one that's garments and one that's something else. So in that situation, it's even, I would think it would be even harder to judge. It would be like that, like the situation where, oh, I have a limited texture vest, but everything that won was in a all over texture vest. And so, how do you judge, a garment when it could be an elaborate lace, full length ball gown versus a stranded color work pair of pants, or I don't know, it's like they're so different, like how it makes it so hard to judge. So what's interesting to me, it was interesting to me was when I would get whatever place, when I would compete and I would get a ribbon, I would look to see who else in my class, what the other things were that were better than mine, that got a better ribbon. Like if I got second place, what got first place, what got third place. And then I would sit there and I would see if I could figure out why that was. Because my assumption typically is if you get a ribbon, the knitting is very good. If you get a first place ribbon, I think you have to get like 98 out of 100 points. Just to get first place. Like if for some reason you entered a category and you were the only competitor, there was no competition, you don't get a first place automatically. If it's not good enough to have gotten first place, if there was a competition, you don't get first place. You might get third place or fourth place. In order for there to be a first place, you have to get at least 98 points. And in most cases, you very rarely you'll get 100 points. They tend to save that for really extraordinary pieces of work. Like one year I saw a pair of gloves. They were entered in the stranded color work gloves, and there are a lot of beautiful things that you would expect to see, 7-8 stitches per inch maybe. And the pair of gloves that won were knit at like 20 stitches per inch. That is so far above what you would typically see, that she not only got, the 100 points, she got the sweepstakes. So sometimes they'll have like a whole huge group of categories. And then out of all of those first place winners, which one is the best of all of that? So those gloves that year, it's just amazing. So the first place usually is 98, 99 points. And then the ones after that, you can see they'll post who the winners are, and what their points. I think they tell you what their points are. I think they do. And so then you can kind of see that a lot of times the first, second, third, they're like they give them like a half a point difference between them. The difference tends to really be a complexity of the item. So like I entered an all over sweater, an Aran sweater I had designed with all over cables. There were a lot of traveling cables, some were closed cables. So it's saddle shoulder. It was very complicated. And I got second place. So I'm like, ooh, I want to see. And I wasn't mad about it. I was just like, oh, I wonder what first place was like. Like what beat that? And so I found it, and it was a sweater that was done in Bavarian traveling twisted stitch patterns. So it's like all over traveling cables, only even another level of complexity. So it's like, oh, okay, I get it. But some people get really mad about it. Like people who are really good knitters will look at things and they'll be mad because, well, that's more creative than that, and that's an element of the competition. It's a competition in knitting expertise, like how good your knitting is, at least in Minnesota. So it's the only way I could think of. I don't know another way to be objective about knitting other than looking at the complexity, the combination of technical skill with complexity, and then on top of that, how is your color? Are your color choices good? And additional things on top of that. But you know, they don't care if you designed it yourself. You can use someone else's pattern. So again, I don't know how you could be objective about it other than by having the most important things be expertise of execution and the level of technical skills. Sort of like Olympic diving competitions where you can have a perfect dive, but your level of difficulty maybe is lower than somebody else's who didn't get perfect. And then when you multiply all that out, the person who was less than perfect wins. So it's kind of like that. So that's the state fair. I just love going to it. I'm gonna go first day this year and then film the competition. You know, like the results and what people are, because you don't know if you won or not until you go in there. They don't post it online until after an hour or two after the doors have opened. And so a lot of the knitters who compete, they get there the first morning, and as soon as they open the doors of creative activities, you know, they're in there. So I think that would be a fun thing to film, people finding their things. So now I want to tell you about what I did this past weekend, and it turns out it is related to the state fair. The place I went was the Oliver Kelley farm, and it's owned and it's run and maintained by the Minnesota Historical Society. I'd gotten an email from them about a month ago saying the Oliver Kelley farm is open for the season, and we were buried under snow. Like, who's going to go to this place right now? And they were advertising their upcoming events, and this past weekend was planting weekend. So you could help them finish their planting. And it was April, and I was like, is the snow ever going to be gone? And when this event came up on my calendar, it reminded me on Friday, I thought, I still didn't know if they were going to be able to plant because we're so behind. Our spring was so late that I didn't know if they were going to actually be able to plant. But so I kind of had that weekend inertia, like, oh, I don't want to leave the house. So I went and looked online to read up about the farm a little bit, to even figure out what it was. And they had quite a bit of information on their website about this man and his family and what his contribution was to not just Minnesota history and agriculture, but also to national history and agriculture. And I ended up learning so much. It was really interesting. So I wanted to go there for two reasons. One was I have ancestors who came to Minnesota before statehood and were homesteaders in the time period that this farm is depicting, which is the 1850s and 1860s when Oliver Kelley was first farming here. And it was a transitional period in farming where they were transitioning from like oxen pulling, they had these plows they were having to do themselves, but the oxen were pulling it. And then there's a transition to horses pulling it, which reduced the amount of labor that was needed. With oxen, you need two men, one leading the oxen and one doing the plow. But with horses, you just need the guy with the plow. So it reduced the amount of labor that was needed. So it's interested in that just to see, well, how were my ancestors farming when they were living here in Minnesota? And the second thing was, I'm pretty sure that when they were advertising this, they had a picture of a sheep, and that was like, oh, sheep, I want to learn more about sheep. So that's the other thing I'm learning about this year, is more about sheep farming. Not that I want to be a sheep farmer, but I'm just learning more about sheep farming and specifically different breeds of wool. So I'd started out just thinking, oh, I want to learn about different wool breeds and see how they knit up. But the more I've been reading about sheep farming, the more I realized that the entire sheep isn't used. Like, they've specialized sheep so much that the ones that are raised for their wool are not used for their meat, and the ones that are raised for the meat, they don't use the wool. And that, which surprised me when I first heard that. So I've been wanting to learn more about it. And what's interesting about this farm is that they have two farms on the farm. They have the old farm, where they have the old farm buildings, all the types of machinery and the buildings that would have been on the farm in the 1850s and 60s, the breeds of animal that they would have had. even this, like the specific breeds, like the sheep that they had back then were called Southdown sheep. And they were one of two breeds that were brought from England to the United States in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And so the Southdown was all over the place. And they were used for their wool and their meat back then. And originally they had black head and then black legs. And they didn't have fleece on their heads. So they only had it on their bodies. And then there was such a huge demand for wool in the 19th century that they started breeding these sheep, first of all, to be bigger, so they had more meat and stuff. But then they were breeding them and so they could get them so they would develop fleece on their heads as well, because then you'd get 3 ounces more wool off of a sheep. So what they've been doing at the farm is breeding them back to their original conformation, the original size that they were. And the thing that they're having the most trouble with is getting rid of the hair on the head and getting them back to being black. So I was there and I saw the small area where they have the sheep and there's some lambs. And I thought, geez, these sheep aren't shorn yet. I wonder why they haven't done shearing yet, because I thought that sheep shearing was done earlier in the season before the lambs were born. But I don't know. That's what I thought was done. But then they have the new part of the farm where they have the breeds, the same types of animal, but the breeds that are now used in Minnesota farm. Well, they don't have oxen anymore. But they do have cows. And so they had some baby calves, they had some chickens, and then they had the kind of sheep that Minnesota farmers now have. And those sheep had been sheared or shorn, one of the two. And I said something to the woman there. I'm like, oh, well, these have been shorn, but the other ones haven't. She's like, yeah, we usually shear them in February or March. Can you guess why? And I said, well, probably before lambing. And she said, yeah, it helps make it cleaner for them. And she said, but in the 19th century, they didn't shear sheep until June. So that's when we'll be shearing the sheep on the old farm. So I was, oh, okay. And so when I was on the old farm, I was talking to a man there, and because I was interested to know if families would have raised their own sheep, like would they raise the wool that they needed, and would the women be spinning their own yarn and stuff? Because I knew a lot of immigrant women brought like spinning wheels, like Norwegian women would have brought their spinning wheels and stuff. And he said, no, we have a lot of spinning wheels here in Minnesota that immigrants brought over, but they didn't keep using them because we had all these woolen mills. It was much simpler. You had better yarn that you'd get from the mills. And he said, oh, there's one over in Anoka. This farm is near a town called Elk River, and which is near Anoka. And he's like, oh yeah, there was a woolen mill in Anoka years ago, and they would have just shipped it all there. So no, they wouldn't have done that. It's just more efficient to send it to the woolen mill and get your fabric, woolen fabric from whoever manufactures that. And they were saying that during the Civil War, the wool was in such high demand that the farmers were breeding a lot more sheep at that time because they needed the wool for the Union Army soldiers. So he was learning all this, and I just thought it was so interesting. But Oliver, why, like, who is Oliver Kelley? I didn't know who Oliver Kelley was. Turns out, now this is more stuff that I learned that I didn't know about. So Oliver Kelley was born in Boston in 1826. And it turns out that this period of time, and it coincides, there's like a whole lot of things going on at one time. So immigration to the United States was really low prior to about 1820. You had a lot of immigration really early in the 1600s until the English Civil Wars, and then it really kind of petered out. Population growth was due to the people who were already here multiplying. But the end of the Napoleonic Wars was in 1820, and that's when immigration to the United States started increasing. So you had that, and then you had the Industrial Revolution. So the manufacturing and industrialization was increasing. And at the same time in Massachusetts, this man named Horace Mann was advocating for the idea of a common school, which is basically public schools. Because before that, schools were kind of a hodgepodge. They weren't really organized in a certain way. It was a lot of times it would be clergy teaching, so kids would learn to read and write like in Sunday school. Or it might be a farmer in the off season, might be, teaching kids. And then, kids would get through a certain level and then they'd be teaching each other. Like, they'd have 14 or 15-year-olds teaching other kids that were younger than them how to teach. So Horace Mann had this idea that to create a non-sectarian, because again, it usually was undertaken by particular religious, like a church would be doing it. So non-sectarian doesn't mean it was secular. It was non-sectarian, and that there was like public schools, and then the creation of normal schools. Normal schools were teacher schools. So normal meaning establishing norms. So you're teaching the teachers how to teach. So that also meant you're going to need more teachers. And they realized that, geez, we have seen women teaching in certain situations, and they do seem to be able to manage to do that. So I guess we could have women being school teachers, and what would be even great, the best thing about that would be that we'd only have to pay them 1/3 of what we were paying the men to be teachers. So this opened up a way for women to earn an income. So like the middle class was beginning to kind of grow at that point, because people were having jobs that they didn't have before. It wasn't just agrarian. And so all of this was happening kind of at the same time. And Oliver Kelley was born in Boston, Massachusetts, right at that time. So he was educated in the public schools of Boston. His dad was a tailor. He did not grow up on a farm. And he went all the way through the equivalent of high school, which would have been really unusual at the time. Like one of my grandfathers was born in like 1906. He had a 4th grade education. His wife, my paternal grandmother, had an 8th grade education. That was very common in that generation. My other grandparents were much more educated. Very unusual that they had as much education as they had. So Oliver Kelley was well educated, and he left Boston when he was 21 to come west, so like 1847. And he worked in Chicago for the Chicago Tribune as a reporter for a while. Then he married a woman, and they moved to the brand new Minnesota Territory. Wisconsin had just become a state and to the east of Minnesota Territory, and Iowa had just become a state to the west or to the south. And so he and his new bride went to Minnesota. Now, at the time, there were 3 cities in Minnesota Territory. There was Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Stillwater. And Stillwater is on the St. Croix River, which divides Wisconsin from Minnesota. And then Minneapolis and St. Paul are about 30 miles west of there. They're on the either opposite sides of the Mississippi River. So then when Oliver Kelley got there, he started working for one of the territorial legislators. They were forming this, government, and they're trying to figure out where we're going to put the capital. And there was a feeling that they might put it in this new village or town called Itasca, which is near where Elk River is today. It was a trading post. There were a lot of Native Americans that lived there, and so they had this trading post, and they were talking about maybe putting the state capital there. So Oliver Kelley bought land there. He bought some land right near there, thinking, oh, well, that's going to be the capital. I'll buy land there because that's sure to grow. Well, instead, they decided that the 3 main institutions every territory or state needed would be divided up amongst the 3 existing cities. So Minneapolis got the University of Minnesota, St. Paul got the Capitol, and then Stillwater got the state prison or territory prison, which is now the state prison. It's still there. So all of those 3 things are still where they were placed in the 1840s. So this little village of Itasca, which doesn't exist anymore, was not going to be the state capital. So Oliver Kelley and his wife moved to the land that he had purchased, which is right on the Mississippi River, and he started a farm there. Now, he was not raised by a farmer, so he was what they called a book farmer. He learned to farm from books and magazines, and what he was learning were all the latest and newest innovations in farming and the newest techniques. He did not learn farming from his father, who learned it from his father, and they always did it this way. He didn't learn it that way. He learned from scratch. So he put in an elaborate irrigation system. He was one of the first people in the state to have a reaper. He tried all different kinds of crops. He's really experimental. The chicken coop that they have on that farm there has a south-facing window at an angle, and the reason that he found in a magazine, and he built it that way. And the reason was because in the winter, you don't get much sun in Minnesota, and it's mostly in the south. And so that way it kept the chicken coop heated up, and then they lost fewer chickens over the course of the winter. So he was very experimental. So that was really interesting. Well, his first wife, they had a baby. She died, and the baby died as an infant in like 1852. But right around that time, he and some other men in their county formed the County Agricultural Society, and they had a county fair. So he was very involved. He was a real leader, and he was very involved in organizing farmers and to learn from each other and to teach and to share information and all that. So that was really important to him. That's a function of the county fair, was to meet and learn from each other. And then the following year, he helped form the Territorial Agricultural Society, which then became the State Agricultural Society. And they were responsible for the state fair. Oliver Kelley was responsible for the Minnesota State Fair, which is the biggest cultural event of the year in Minnesota still to this day. And I thought that was so amazing, but that's not all. He and his second wife had 4 daughters, and they came of age after the Civil War. And they were in a generation, according to this man I was talking to at the farm, they were in a generation that married at the lowest rate of any generation prior to that and since then. And part of that was because of the Civil War, and so many men died, and there just weren't as many men to marry, but also because women had an opportunity to earn money. And so Oliver Kelley, he was farming on his farm until after the Civil War, and then he was working in Washington. He'd go back and forth between Washington, D.C., and then in the summers he'd farm. And he was really trying to do some organization. He's doing a lot of writing, trying to organize farmers. So after the Civil War, Andrew Johnson asked him to go down south and try to get farmers there interested in sort of a national organization of farmers. But of course, the southern farmers really weren't interested in a northerner asking them to get involved in this national group. And so what he did, he was a Mason. He was, I think, the second man in the territory to become a Mason, which is a fraternal organization. So he went to other groups of Masons and talked to them as a Mason to get them to be part of this organization. And the organization is called the Grange, and I remember reading this in Little House on the Prairie books about the Grange. I knew it was some kind of farmer's thing. I didn't know what it was. There's a much longer name for it. But he was credited as being one of the 7 founding members of the Grange. But it turns out that he had this administrative assistant who was his niece, Carolyn Hall, who he talked with a lot about the Grange when they were organizing it. And she pointed out to him that farms are not run by men, that organizations like the Masons are male-only organizations, but farms rely on families. It isn't a one man running a farm, it's a family, and it requires both the man and the woman they had their divided roles, but they were equally important. And she said, you can't have an organization of farmers and exclude the women. So when the Grange was founded, it's in the documents that they have to have four, like if there's a board of 16 people, 4 of them have to be women. So from the beginning, and that was Carolyn Hall, his niece's input. And it was years. It was like the 1890s. So it was like 20 years or something after the Grange was founded when they finally recognized that she was actually one of the 8 founding members of the Grange, and they finally credited her, acknowledged her. And according to this guy I was talking to at the farm, that when the Grange took a vote on whether or not to support women's suffrage, women's right to vote in the 1880s, it passed. Like, they agreed on women's suffrage. So while Kelley was going back and forth doing all this work with the Grange, back and forth to Washington, D.C., his 2 oldest daughters were managing the farm for 12 years. They ran the farm. And several of his 4 daughters became school teachers. And then at some point, the family moved to Florida. Like, they'd go to Florida for winters, and then they'd come back up to Minnesota to farm in the winters or in the summers. And so he was like a real estate agent. He was like, I don't know. He had his finger in a lot of things, but he started a town called Rio Caravelle or something like that down in Florida. They had a hotel. So one of his daughters ran the hotel. One was the postmistress. Their one of them was the school teacher, or maybe one of them did 2 of those things. I don't know. But so his daughters, none of them ever married, and they all had careers. And I thought that was super interesting. But the thing that I just appreciate the most about Oliver Kelley, a man who I had no idea of, was the fact that he was one of the founding members of the State Agricultural Society that runs the Minnesota State Fair, that has the creative activities competition, where knitters have the biggest and best knitting competition in the entire country. I hope that you will look into your state and county fairs, either as a competitor or just to go and look at the knitting that people have submitted, because it's really amazing to me and inspiring to see not just the knitting that people do, but also the other creative outlets that people have, whether it's crop art or woodworking or beading or weaving, or things that you have never seen before that you have no idea what it's even called. It's so interesting to me to see how creative people are and how they express it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.